Public order. Since we're almost talking about it already, let's switch into the topic of public order. In Rome 3, the public order system will be, just like integrity earlier, based on a trend towards a stable value, not absolute increases or decreases per turn. So if the public order is minus 30, that doesn't mean it is falling by 30 points per turn, it means the settlement is in a discontent rut and won't take much more pressure before going down to dangerous levels. Like with integrity, having low public order gives a chance every turn of negative things happening. Being at say minus 80 will give you rebellions, being at around minus 50 might give you riots that damage buildings, and being near minus 30 might occasionally cause training or construction to skip a turn. The idea is that you can keep a settlement that hates you in check if you want. They won't inevitably rebel over small minus 2 public order issues. Public order will change by a set amount each turn, moving from what it currently is towards the value that all the factors are pointing at. So let's say a settlement gets minus 30 public order from tax. If it started at 0, it will fall down to minus 30 over a few turns, then stay there. But if they then get an amazing governor that gives plus 50 public order, 50 positive influence minus 30 negative influence means that 20 is the new stable point. Over a few more turns, the settlement moves up from minus 30 to 20 and then stays there. There will of course be bonuses to maintaining high public order, perhaps buildings randomly completing quicker, faster development of public buildings, more population growth, that kind of thing. It wouldn't be the case that, as in Rome 2, every region just slowly grows up to 100 then sits there because the rate of change is plus 2 or something. Instead, most settlements will be more moderate, tending to be in between minus 50 and positive 50, with ones that are outside of this range being special cases. This makes a little more sense, I think, as people don't really get ecstatic about their faction without proper cause, so having most just be content with the arrangement seems reasonable. One new thing you'll especially need to consider with public order is how recruiting troops will affect it. You are allowed to take a unit or two from a settlement with no penalty, but once more are taken, the public order starts to get a growing penalty due to the state taking all their best men. If you take everyone, you will be in the unique position that public order will get really low, but the settlement can't rebel as you have the entire military-age population in your armies. But the intense rioting and damage to state property that comes from this might be annoying, and even cause order to drop further. If order drops insanely low, like to minus 95 or lower, you will just lose control of the region without a rebellion. The people have all unilaterally decided to ignore you and will form their own leadership to listen to. This creates a new faction, possibly a re-emerging one if it wasn't a core of your faction, and you are by default at war with this faction. If we're feeling really detailed, we could have something where troops raised from that settlement will be really bad at taking it back. In battle, they would just retreat right away or keep skirmishing away from the enemy. But that might be too complicated and throw people who don't realise what the problem is, so we'll throw that in towards the end of the detailed design phase if we decide the game isn't deep enough yet. Now, when it comes to managing public order, the most common method in Total War is to garrison troops in an unruly settlement, the idea being that seeing these men will make people feel less open in their criticisms. I would like there to be a slight turnaround on this by having Rome 3's people actually not like having armies living in their homes, which is where the troops actually go, by the way. They just squat in people's houses, more formally known as billeting. So just dumping an army in a settlement will actually reduce public order unless the settlement has a military building like a barracks, in which case we suppose the army hangs out there and doesn't cause any trouble. In this case, the knowledge that an army can deploy into the settlement at any time might actually subdue dissent, so this will improve public order. A similar improvement, lesser in intensity, will occur from just having an army in the region, for the same reasons. The effect of this will be heightened if the army is stationed in a fort in the region as a more permanent measure. This way, there will always still be a way to improve public order with troops as players expect. It's just that settlements with military buildings will be able to get a bigger effect out of it. It also means having armies sit in unmilitarized settlements as a deterrent against attack might not be sustainable. You'll have to try something else to stop that invasion you're paranoid about. A last little touch to public order is that it would be cool if the public order in the settlement where your faction leader is affected in some way the ruler's chamber scene. Maybe adding appropriate crowd noises from outside, or having the door open when things are happy and barred closed when they're dodgy. Not needed, but would be a nice immersive bit of polish. Army replenishment and wounding. Back to a bit of military stuff now. The method by which an army that has taken losses is restored to full strength will, in Rome 3, be a mix of the newer auto-regen system and the system used just once in Empire, where new troops are recruited for money. To explain how exactly the Rome 3 replenishment system works, I will first need to explain the concept of wounding, a little mechanic that is actually present in Rome 1 and will now make a return, merged into the broader replenishment mechanics. In Rome 1, you may remember you had a casualty healing system in the battle results, where some troops you had lost will randomly come back, simulating how they were only out of the battle due to non-career-ending injuries. In Rome 3, this will return, with a portion of losses in battle actually being wounds rather than deaths. What that portion is will be a thing that you improve via army upgrades, commander abilities, ruler bonuses, and some more micromanaging methods that will be covered when we talk about the battle system later on. So after a battle, let's say you lost 20% of your men and half of those losses were wounds, or in other words, 10% of your army died, 10% was wounded. In the turns after the battle, you'll see a replenishment mechanic just like Rome 2 has now, but that replenishment will stop when it's up to 90%, because only the wounded troops encamped with the army can actually rejoin the regiments without any special effort. Having this replenishment allows you to not be so pressured to micromanage troop replacements as you are in the early Total War games. And I'm assuming that annoying micromanagement was why CA took the manual replenishment features out of their later titles. As a note on design principles, I'm all for reducing micromanagement, but only when that micromanagement isn't adding to the depth of the game. Strategy games are a genre where ability to micromanage and how deep, replayable and fun to master the game is are very much correlated. So although I want Rome 3 to retain a lot of streamlining, I want it to be the right streamlining. Things that make it legitimately easier to enjoy without removing how much of it there is to enjoy, if that makes sense to you. Anyway, for the other 10% of your missing army, the dead 10%, you need to recruit new troops. This is where the Empire system comes in. In Empire, you could select a depleted army and click a button beside it to order replacement troops to be trained. And this actually costs the amount of money that those units cost proportionally, so getting 20% of a line infantry unit back cost you 20% of the full unit's initial training cost. Now, it was still streamlined to make it a quite thoughtless process, since you could replenish anywhere, including in enemy territory, and it always took 2 turns to do it regardless of how far you were from a place that could actually train the unit in question. For Rome 3, I wanted to be just a bit more sensible, as the Empire approach was so basic as to be immersion breaking in my opinion. Not to mention too easy, since it made steamrolling sprees very possible even if you kept nearly losing the fights. Firstly, you will still be able to order replenishments while in enemy territory, but only if you have a supply line heading back to one of your settlements, representing how reinforcements come up the line with the supplies to join the army. If you are in friendly territory, you will be able to get replacements at any time, regardless of how the army is supplied, just to make things easy to manage. There is a nice and endless depth to which you could start bringing in rules to relate how long it takes for replacements for a given unit to arrive with how far the nearest training centre for that unit is. Although I think personally it could be interesting to include that in the game, for simplicity's sake, unit replenishment speed will ignore the training time entirely. This simplification is based on the idea that you are not necessarily recruiting new, freshly trained replacements from the barracks, but that you're just taking any old recruit, putting them into an established unit, and then the officers and men in that unit train them up to the standard they expect. If you're willing to accept that as plausible, which does indeed require ignoring how these men get any specialist equipment the unit has, then hopefully following these rules will seem reasonable. For armies being replenished along their supply line, the time until replenishments arrive is however long it takes a standard military unit to move from the supply point to the army. The replacements will basically be an invisible army in the game's logic, moving towards you and silently arriving at the end of the last turn of travel, causing your units to be restored. Keep in mind that the army might move further away from the supply centre, which would increase the time until replenishment, or move it closer to do the opposite. A little number alongside the info will indicate how many turns it is until the reinforcements arrive. For armies in your own territory, the replenishment takes 1 turn, so you hit the button and as long as you don't leave the region, the troops will be in the army at the start of the next turn, ready to use. Now this might be a little fishy for elite units that couldn't possibly be equipped and trained that fast. Might seem unfair that it is just as fast to rebuild an army of legionaries as it is to rebuild an army of levied spears. But hopefully this will be made up for by the consideration that the replacements cost money. So although you're getting your elite units back as quick as the regular units, it's costing you a heck of a lot more to be doing it. If, after testing, that doesn't really feel like it balances it out, then we could introduce a system where it will take different numbers of turns to replenish different unit tiers, but for simplicity I'd like to start without trying that. I do totally understand the benefits to the fun of the game of having an easy replenishment system, so I don't want to go too hardcore here, just a bit more hardcore so it isn't so cheesy. One key thing I want to avoid from the current Rome 2 system is how rare and elite units can be replenished really fast for free, which means the campaign is very imbalanced towards the use of armies made up entirely of the best units, since the consequence of losing them is just the same as the consequence of losing the lowest muddy spearmen. They regenerate troops equally fast and for the same cost, i.e. free. Well, technically it wasn't free. The way it worked from Napoleon onwards was that unit upkeep cost was level regardless of whether the unit had 2 guys in it or 200, so the fact you were losing extra money while the unit was under strength was taken to be the cost of training new men to replace them. That is useful because it means your army upkeep costs across the faction don't change if you don't recruit anything, giving you nice and predictable finances even during wars. But to that I say, it doesn't need to be predictable. Playing Empire, I think the system of having weak armies cost less and letting the player decide to choose when to restore them is much deeper, especially as replenishing an army after a battle costs the amount that you need to make a building a lot of the time, so there is a valid strategic route where you could just barely hang on with battered armies in order to get faster economic or tech growth in the long run, a path for experienced players that explicitly rewards your ability to win battles with limited resources. It would probably help if the replenishment button told you how much your turnly income would change, as well as the upfront costs to help with planning here. Also, just to be clear, when you manually order replacements, you can choose to do it for a single unit if needed, which will be useful if you only want to budget a small amount of money to new troops. But it would also be nice to just hit the replenish all button or something similar for when you are willing to pay whatever the cost. Keep in mind, though, that with all this replacement ordering business, we need to refer back to the concept of the global unit pool from earlier. You might need to recruit 1,283 Hastati to fill up your army, but your faction can only equip 846 right now, so you simply can't fully replace your losses in a single turn. You'll remember that you can still recruit new units when the pool is empty, just really slowly, 4 times slower than usual to be exact. Well, to be consistent, the same must happen here. Replacements from an empty pool will take 4 turns for all units, i.e. 4 times the normal 1 turn. So in our example just now, if I hit the replace button on my 1,283 Hastati, after 1 turn I would have 846 back since they were in the unit pool, but I have to wait another 3 turns to get those 437 still missing. Just like when you recruit units from an empty pool, recruiting replacements from an empty pool will stop the pool from refilling for the duration of the training. So here the pool would be 0 after the first turn and stay there until the 5th turn, assuming no other recruitment of that unit happened. Wintering and forts. It's time to talk about what your armies will be doing during winter, and since forts will play a role, talk about how forts in general will feature in Rome 3. Winter will be a bigger deal than it is in the current Total War games that have seasons. It won't just be a case of minus 10% movement range and taking attrition. It will be minus 50% movement range, attrition of both a killing and wounding nature, the wounding meant to represent men getting too ill to fight but not dying, integrity losses, and the inability to be properly supplied. The intensity of these effects depends on map location, since there are parts of the ancient world where campaigning winter is still viable, so generally these winter points are going to be most important for the top half of the map. Winter is intended to provide a slight break in the campaign gameplay, encouraging the player to return armies to safe areas to replenish and train. Attacking during winter will be very difficult, although not impossible if you prepare adequate supplies and don't need to go very far. But generally, both the player and AI will focus on economic development and faster turns during winter, just getting ready for the actions of the rest of the seasons. Now, because of the difficulty of getting supplies in winter, you might find your armies running out of supplies even just standing in your own lands. Historically, armies were not deployed in winter, but if they needed to be used the following year, they would be wintered, which usually meant taking a long stay in a city or military base. In Rome 3, the same option will be available, putting your men into garrisons come winter, either at a settlement or fort. When I say fort, I'm not referring to the fort system from Rome 2, where you enter a fortified stance to get a little fortified camp on the battle map if attacked. That will still be there, but will only protect against attrition. You can still run out of supplies. Instead, you need a fort in the Rome 1 tradition, where it is actually a permanent place on the map that you have built, able to stockpile supplies as discussed earlier. Like in Rome 1, these forts will be initially constructed by your armies. In Rome 3, there will be a button to construct a fort, and when clicked on, it asks you where you want to put it. You hover over spots on the map, and it tells you whether you are allowed to build a fort there. This is meant to avoid Rome 1's issue where unspecified limitations on where you could build forts left you wasting your army's movement points walking around trying to find a valid place. It also shows you an outline of where the fort's zone of control will be, so that you can make sure the fort defends key locations. Once you give the order, the army moves to that location and starts building when it arrives. The construction time will be quite short, because at first the fort you get is quite basic. A wooden construction with proper walls, towers and gates, bigger than the forts as portrayed in Rome 2, but still liable to fall to an attacker with siege equipment. So the army might just have to sit there for 2 turns to make these, perhaps shorter if you have a ruler bonus that gives -1 to fort construction times. The fort, once ready, is managed almost like a mini settlement. You can give it a name and direct supplies to be stockpiled there. It will have 1 or 2 garrison units to start with, representing the permanent staff you have assigned to upkeep the force. These troops will be taken from the nearest settlement with military population available. The fort will have a couple of building slots available inside, where you'll be able to build a limited set of things with functionality similar to settlement buildings but with reduced effect. So you might put in there a supply dump so you can have a large cap to the supplies you can store there, useful for forward bases. You might have an intelligence office that increases the fort's line of sight and zone of control, useful for defensive bases. That intelligence office, by the way, might also act like a level 5 spy doing counter-spying, stopping low-level enemy spies from ever getting inside could be quite handy. One of the building slots would be the fort itself, allowing you to purchase some costly but possibly life-saving upgrades to the base as a whole. So it might start as a small fort with only 1 free slot. Then it upgrades to a large fort with 3 free slots, granting stronger walls, a larger area on the battle map and extra towers. Then a final and really expensive upgrade is to a castle fort, perhaps with a better name. A fort that isn't really any bigger but has massively enhanced defences like stone walls, mutually supporting defensive towers, trenches and stakes covering all but narrow approaches. Basically a proper fortress that you will very occasionally build to massively enhance the chances of a small army beating a large one by hiding inside. Inside the stone walls, wooden towers would be scattered through the base so that your defender's advantage could continue even if the walls were lost. The place will be vulnerable to heavy siege attacks, of course, but the ability to upgrade the walls with defensive ballistas and onagers instead of archery towers will help counter this. These castle forts would have big zones of control and be very easy to defend, meaning that if placed in such a way that an enemy will have to attack it to use a pass or river crossing, you can have a really secure border at a nice extortionate price. They will still be possible to siege out, but with a nice reserve of supplies inside, it will hopefully take long enough for you to react to the enemy's invasion. They need to be very expensive to represent the rarity of such well-defended military positions, which really weren't used historically since the resources to do this are better spent fortifying actual settlements. But the option will be there for the commander who wants to keep the enemy out of their lands entirely. It would also require some of the higher level technological developments to be feasible, so small Brittonic tribes who can't even fortify their settlements with stone towers aren't going to be able to access this fort type until they have developed sufficiently. So bringing it back to wintering, you will be able to pop these forts in handy locations, even in enemy regions, in order to use them as winter bases, hopefully providing more convenient safe areas than settlements, and perhaps even forward enough to spot a chance for a winter attack, since the AI is wintering men too, so we'll have redistributed its troops around. Zones of control and interceptions. Let's move on now to a topic related to forts that I keep name-dropping, that is, zones of control. This isn't a new feature and nothing is radically changing here, just the resurrection of a great old feature. To be clear what I mean, the zone of control is the coloured circle around an army or settlement that represents the area in which the army or garrison can fight battles. In Rome 2, this is used to manage how reinforcements work. When a battle is started, any armies for whom the battle is in their zone of control will join the fight. That aspect will still work almost the same in Rome 3, and I'll talk more about reinforcement armies in a moment. But we'll also be bringing back a feature from Empire and Napoleon, the idea of the interception. Interception is something that, playing later games, turns out to be something so absolutely required to play the game strategically that its absence is a regular source of frustration. In short, the interception rule means that if an enemy army walks into the zone of control of one of your armies or settlements during their turn, you are shown a battle screen with the option to attempt a battle or to allow them to pass through. So if 3 mob units walk close to your army, you will just kill them. But if a giant army walks past a small force of yours, you choose to let it pass. This creates a really logical system of big powerful forces being able to go wherever they want, but generally meaning armies have to work to get past enemy positions. In later games you regularly see really annoying cases where retreating armies will run right through your river crossing defences or settlements untouched because you just aren't allowed to try and stop them. Here's how Rome 3 will handle making an interception. When an enemy army is moving on a route that will take it through a zone of control, it will move slowly, in the same way that it does when it's moving to attack one of your armies. Whenever it enters a zone of control of one of your settlements or armies, you are shown a matchup, just like the pre-battle screen, where you see your men and what is known about the enemy army. Time slows down a bit more, but crucially it does not stop. You don't have all the time in the world to make an interception decision. And as you inspect the details of the armies, the enemy army is slowly moving through your zone. If it leaves before you click anything, you missed your chance. If you say yes to intercept, then a battle is initiated at the location where the army was when you made the decision, so you better make it before they cross that river your fort is meant to be defending. It's an ordinary battle, so the enemy army may just retreat, but whatever their original movement plan was is messed up. They are forced to retreat in a direction that gets them out of your zone of control as quickly as possible, which means an early challenge can force them to go right back the way they came. But if you're indecisive and challenge them just before they reach the other side of your zone, their line of retreat is probably not going to be too different from where they were going anyway. This rewards a quick decision, but of course a quick decision might be the wrong one, so know yourself and know your enemy for best results. Later on, I'll talk more about making retreats on the campaign map, which should help you fully imagine how this will work. People might not like the sound of a timed decision, but I think it will nicely simulate the way you need to make a leadership call on a passing situation. You can always just decline if you aren't sure, but the enemy might end up somewhere annoying by the end of it. From the other point of view, that of you walking your men into an enemy zone of control, in later games that just wasn't allowed, but in Empire, Napoleon and now Rome 3 you can choose to do it if you think they will be too intimidated to try and stop you. The system was a little janky in the older games, which is probably why it got dropped altogether, but here's how it will work in Rome 3. Let's say I'm moving an army through a region and want to attack an enemy fort on the other side of their settlement because I know it's undefended and full of supplies I'd rather like to have. I order my men to attack the fort, and the line of attack is right through the zone of control of the settlement, not around the edge of it. When I give the order, before any movement happens at all, the game makes a judgment for me based on what we currently know about the force in the settlement, a judgment on whether the AI will consider an interception. It might see that the settlement has 2 units in it and definitely won't bother intercepting, so the move just goes ahead with nothing unusual happening. But then again, it might see the settlement actually has a full army inside it, which I had failed to pay attention to when planning my move. A screen pops up showing me the known composition of the army, and warning that I might have to fight it to complete the requested movement. The key part is that it might try to intercept me, not that it certainly will. The game is just letting me know the risks. I can either say forget it and the movement is cancelled, my men having not moved at all, or say go ahead anyway and see if they actually do intercept. Now it might turn out that I actually didn't know that the enemy had an army in the settlement because I hadn't spied properly. So in that case the game won't warn me about a possible interception, I'll just have to deal with it if it happens. As for the whole timing element, the AI needs to be a little shackled here because obviously it will decide if it's going to attack or not in a split second, so it would be unfair to always have the interception right away since the retreat direction is the least useful. Instead, the decision to intercept will be mixed with a decision as to when. It would probably be a little dose of randomness, but influenced by the nature of the defending force. An army with a high-level general will have its attack occur very early on to represent his quick judgment, and a garrison force or captained army might do it at any point with even a chance of the AI making the decision to intercept but not actually doing it, simulating the commander choking out at the last second in the same way that the player might if they weren't confident. Of course, the player won't know that's why they didn't intercept. It will just mean that when you are running the gambit past a superior army, you can logically expect to be less likely to get away with it if there's an experienced commander involved, which sounds fair to me. Another factor to experienced commanders is that, in fact, they will be less likely to make the decision to intercept unless they have a very clear advantage. The reason is that they know ultimately your goal is to take the settlement, so you'll have to attack them in their strong point eventually. Doing an interception ruins that, so they will be likely to let you walk around if you outmatch them in strength. However, a low-level commander might be more tempted to come out and fight, so this interception system will be usable as a way to deliberately bait enemies out of strong points by making it look like you're going to attack some target beyond it. One special case you might be wondering about is what happens when the movement order isn't to run through the zone of control, but just into it, stopping within the zone of control for whatever reason. In this case, you will have the little timing aspect during the movement, but once the army stops, the decision just hangs for as long as you want. This means the simulation of the enemy choking won't happen either. If they decide to intercept, they will certainly do it, it just might be after you stopped moving. In actuality, though, the enemy may be less likely to try and intercept you when moving into a zone of control and stopping than when moving through it or moving from within it to a new position outside. It's the same reason as above. If they see you walking up to their settlement, they are apt to suppose you mean to attack it, so they won't bother coming out to fight unless they overwhelm you in power. This will be especially tricky to balance to make sure you can't exploit the AI too hard by baiting them, but it still needs to be doable since baiting in this way is a legitimate historical strategy. Just to make things confusing, it's all the opposite for a field situation, where experienced commanders are more likely to intercept you than inexperienced ones, since there is little to be lost by doing so. It is important that field commanders intercept armies who are trying to stop within their zone of control because of one of the key rules surrounding zones of control in Rome 3. If you are in the zone of control of a hostile army, you cannot do interceptions. To clarify, this means that if I walk my army right up next to an enemy army in the field and they don't intercept me. To clarify, this means that if I walk an army right up next to an enemy army in the field and they don't intercept me, from now on we are both inside each other's zones of control, and neither of us can do interceptions on anything but each other. This is to represent how armies in each other's zones are basically in a standoff, afraid to leave their camps for anything since the other side will just destroy it. It makes much more sense if you consider the distances involved to be much smaller than those shown on the campaign map. The scale of the campaign map is much larger than the mechanics of the game fit with anyway. This is just another case of that. If you were camped just 1,000 meters from the enemy camp, you wouldn't leave camp to attack another army you saw moving behind you, as your own camp would just be destroyed, along with all the supplies, gear, camp followers, and morale of your army. Good reason for the rule or not, it is needed for gameplay reasons ultimately. That is because it allows you to lock down forces by getting them stuck in the zone of control of an equal or better force that they aren't likely to intercept, then move other weaker armies right past them while interception is disabled, or move them in close to be reinforcements in an upcoming battle. The side that initiates the deadlock basically has an advantage as it's still their turn, letting them move in more armies or split their army into groups to attack from different sides before starting the battle. A good commander wouldn't allow the enemy the chance to outmaneuver them like this, which is why good generals will try to intercept even when the fight is even in cases where you seem to be just trying to enter a deadlock. But for the sake of fun, lesser commanders won't be able to do this. This is a little unbalanced as you can always intercept the enemy when they do this to you, knowing that it brings an advantage, meaning the mechanic does favour the player. But there is one aspect to consider that might make you forego the interception, and that is the idea of battlefield defences, which will be covered in detail later on. In a nutshell though, defending armies in regular battles will be able to fortify their battlefields, but this isn't the case in interception battles. So even if you think the enemy is trying to lock you down to surround and attack you, you might just let them do it because you think they don't have that many forces anyway, and you'd rather fight them from a fortified position, even if it does get attacked from all sides right away. But as I said, more on this later. How it changes the value of interception will be an issue of careful balance, I'm sure. Another factor that comes into play is line of sight, which is much reduced for armies that are in deadlock, again simulating their focus. That means that not only can an army pass nearby without being intercepted, it can pass unnoticed. This can be useful to secretly position reinforcements near a deadlocked army before attacking so that you can get a surprise advantage in battle, but it works both ways. Generally, you want to have spies embedded in armies that are deadlocked so they can keep a wide line of sight, or have spies behind the enemy lines to look for possible reinforcement armies approaching. It will be possible to break a deadlock by running, however the other army will get an interception check, so it might force a battle as you leave. But if they didn't attack you already, they probably don't want to fight, so escaping will usually be possible. Now keep in mind that just like in Empire and Napoleon, the interception doesn't happen with armies that are actually attacking whatever it is that is generating the zone of control. So when an army attacks you, you don't have to decide whether to intercept it as it approaches, you just get the battle right where you're standing. Technically there is no reason why you couldn't intercept them, but this will be easier to manage, fewer things popping up all the time to click on, and hopefully you'll have your army standing somewhere good anyway, so you'd rather fight at their current location. Also keep in mind that when either the player or AI decides whether to intercept, the battle screen will include all reinforcements that would come to the fight. So you can't put a stack on the edge of a zone of control, then send 3 units forward to try and get intercepted close enough to your army to bring them into the battle. The AI will include the army in reinforcement range in its assessment of potential battles at each location. Something you as a player will need to do quickly when the enemy is in your zones, especially if the movement of the army will take it in and out of different reinforcement zones, and there is a sweet spot where you can attack it without it being supported. That would be the kind of quick time event I can really get into. Reinforcements and multi-army battles. Since we're on the topic of reinforcements, let's now consider how battles involving more than 2 armies will work in Rome 3. I said earlier that it will work almost the same as Rome 2 in terms of the zone of control, defining whether an army is in range of the battle, with the difference being that reinforcement distances will be a little bigger than zones of control. Think of the zone of control as having a thick border on the edge, through which an army can walk without being intercepted, but if it stops to fight, then the army generating the zone of control will get involved. Since we have the interception system, you need this extra reinforcement range to make it so that you can walk an army up into the maximum reinforcement range without triggering an interception, allowing your main force to then go in and trigger the battle. Empire and Napoleon didn't have this, which is probably why people got frustrated with interceptions. Unlike in Rome 2, Rome 3 will make a distinction between the battle being right next to a reinforcing army and being on the edge of its reinforcement range. The distinction will be made via a feature brought forward from Rome 1, the idea that reinforcements can be delayed. Simply put, the amount of time between the start of the battle and the arrival of a reinforcement army will depend on how far away it actually was, ranging from pretty much instant when it's right next to you to a 15-minute delay when it's at its maximum distance. This opens up new, broad strategic options where you play for time to await your own men, or go in really hard and aggressive right at the start to make sure the enemy reinforcements arrive to a losing battle. In Rome 2, I think they avoided this sort of thing since there was a cap in the number of units per army. They made it so that multiple armies could just roughly move together and then on the battlefield act like one big army, since you got all the reinforcements before the actual battle had time to start. But now, since there is no limit to units in the army, you don't need to take that into consideration. It will mean that you have reinforcements mainly when defending, since when attacking you will likely combine everything together unless you're in a big rush. And moreover, it increases the chance that a combined attacker will face a divided, off-guard set of defending armies, with the initial army being at a disadvantage until the reinforcements arrive. Since there is a delay, this gives the chance for epic holding actions, hoping to be saved by a huge rear attack coming 10 minutes into the battle. So you'll have increased tension in battles and a deeper campaign situation because the positioning of armies will matter more. Choosing positions with more reasoning will give room for expert players to plan their distribution of forces more. The reinforcement delay posits a strategic dilemma when paired with the interception mechanic, as concentrating different forces near each other makes battles easier, but having them spread apart means more area is covered by their zones of control, so you are safer on a strategic level. It will be down to the precise situation to determine which arrangement is better, providing something else for expert players to master their judgment on, but ultimately not mattering an enormous amount so new players aren't going to be stung too hard. You might remember earlier I introduced the idea that reinforcement armies which you can't see on the campaign map don't appear in the pre-battle menu. I think this makes perfect sense, as the whole point of scouting the enemy is to know their strength before attacking. So, when initiating a battle, any troops you don't know about just won't appear on the enemy's side and won't influence the balance bar, meaning you will be truly surprised when they show up in battle, which I think makes more sense than being told in advance and being given the chance to leave upon knowing this. When combined with the delay, I think this will make for some epic moments where you defeat a whole enemy army, think you've basically won, then see a second army marching onto the field ready to smash your depleted troops, forcing you to pull out some expert play to still win or simply admit defeat and withdraw. And of course, you can do the same thing back to the enemy if they aren't properly scouting you. We'll briefly dip now into talking about battles themselves so as to consider how reinforcements will enter the field. As well as the delay, there is also the matter of their approach direction to consider. In Rome 3, you will have a little bit of choice here, which I think is really needed since in Rome 2 you often get unhelpful reinforcement directions and wonder why you couldn't send a rider to tell them not to arrive on the other side of the field from your fortified hill instead of blundering into the enemy's deployment zone. Around the edge of the battlefield during the deployment phase, you will have a clearly marked arrow, showing where your reinforcements plan to come in. It starts at the nearest point, just like it does in Rome 2. Above it hangs an indicator of how long it will be until they arrive. You can click and drag this arrow around the edge of the battlefield, dropping it in a new place that suits you more. The further you drag it from the initial position, the larger the increase to the arrival delay there is as a punishment. So you will be able to tell an army coming from behind the enemy to actually circumvent the battle and join it from behind you instead, but that will add 10 minutes to the delay, so you need to be ready for that. The enemy will know that you've done this, and if the AI is having a good day, use the extended window to fight you before you're ready. More likely, you'll position the reinforcements to give a nice chance to outflank the enemy. If you're unlucky with the initial reinforcement direction, now you can pay the price in time to still get a shot at doing this. There will be a rule that in battles where both sides have reinforcements, the side with the closer army picks their reinforcement direction first, so the side with slower reinforcements can react to that choice, giving the first side a little extra initiative in that they will force a reaction from the slower side. There will also be a rule that you have to pick a direction that isn't right on top of the direction picked by the opponent, so that you can't get armies walking in on top of each other and messing things up, just for the sake of simplicity and making sense. Not that this rule makes sense, since the reinforcements could fight each other before they arrived, but for ease of play that possibility is ignored as it always has been in Total War. A campaign attack example. So now, having gone through the zone of control, interception and reinforcement mechanics of Rome 3, let's quickly describe a real example to give an idea of how they all fit together, especially since zones of control bringing a load of geometry into the mix, and it probably sounds more confusing than it really is. There is an enemy army on my border, and I've decided I'm going to bring my army out from the region settlement to attack them, hoping to win and then counterattack their settlement before they recruit more men. I walk my army up to the reinforcement ring at the edge of their zone of control. Now I send a spy out to see what is behind their army. Seeing that the coast is clear, I decide I'm going to make a large-scale cavalry rear attack, hoping to emulate the success of the Romans in the opening scene of Gladiator. To make it be successful, I want my cav to be right behind the enemy army and roughly halfway into their zone of control, meaning my cav will show up a few minutes into the battle. Any closer, and they might show up before I've had a chance to advance against the enemy, so would not be as useful. And although I'm not sure how far the line of sight of a deadlocked army will be, I am probably thinking of having the cavalry remain unseen, so they are surprise reinforcements. But I can't just send 4 units of cav to the back of their army, since the enemy might just intercept them as soon as they get out of reinforcement range of my main army. So I need to get my main army and the enemy army into a deadlock. That means I just need to walk right into their zone of control and see if they stop me from encamping in front of them. Luckily for me, their commander isn't too confident, so decides to stay put, hoping to take advantage of some improved defences on the battlefield, which remember he only gets if he doesn't rush forward to meet my advance on the campaign map. So I've deadlocked the enemy now, allowing me to send my 4 cav to go and sit behind the enemy as planned. Now if I wanted, I could just leave this standoff and end the turn. The enemy are stuck in my zone of control and have to attack my main army to get out of it. So by waiting to see if they will do that, I might manage to get the defender's advantage, plus if I was careful, then my cavalry would still be in reinforcement range of my main force. But of course, waiting a turn means the enemy might reinforce themselves. If they brought up a couple of units of spears to challenge my cav detachment, I would suddenly be at a big disadvantage. Let's say I suspect that an enemy fort, just out of my line of sight, contains such a force. So I want to get this battle started before they arrive. So no waiting a turn, I attack right when my cav are in position. The enemy has the defender's advantage, but in the battle I put pressure on them right away, drawing their troops into combat with mine, so that after 7 minutes when my cav appear at the enemy's back line, I can get tasty rear charges without worrying about dodging their frontline troops or cav defences. Now you might ask, how is this really better than keeping the cav in your army and just sitting them on the edge of the map until the time is right? The answer is that of information. Cav visible on the field to the enemy are less valuable than cav who will appear by surprise. We'll talk more about battles later, but hopefully the AI will be able to see that you have 4 cav in your army, and keep an appropriate flank or rear reserve. But if they are reinforcements, the AI might not have prepared for them at all, and may not even know that you have reinforcements at all if they had poor scouting information on the campaign map. Of course, both approaches, reinforcement attacks and just straight up battlefield maneuver, will be doable, and in many situations your choice might not matter. But you may be able to gain a little edge by making the right decision. Maybe you will see that the enemy has more infantry than you, so it will probably have a wide line with lots of reserves. In that case, it might be better to have your cav arrive late to the battle so that the infantry will get committed before the AI starts taking the cav into account. How this all works out in practice will be down to the details, so we'll have to work hard to make sure both routes are viable strategic choices. The naval campaign. Let's talk about how control of the seas and use of navies will work in Rome 3. The importance of having dominance over waters around your lands is increased, since supply lines and food trading routes can be over water, and having those get messed up might land you in big trouble. Navies will be like armies in that their size is not hard limited. They will by default have a very large supply reserve as each ship stores supplies for their voyages, but a supply barge ship type or something similar will be available to boost it further if needed, acting like a baggage train effectively. One rule though will be that navies without supply ships will take attrition if they sail too far from coastlines, just like in Rome 2, but now even more limiting. This is to simulate the fact that ships of the period generally didn't carry all that many supplies and would often go ashore during journeys. As a simplification, they don't actually take food from these coastal regions, instead just having a bigger initial supply to give them the longevity they would have with coastal excursions. Not my personal preference, but I think people will like this more because it will be easier to manage. Especially with fleets passing by your coasts, you don't want them suddenly making you food negative. There's already enough hassle with armies being able to do that. The limited area of operation will make naval interceptions easier, as having a navy on your coastline will stop the enemy sailing past unless they want to take attrition. A key difference with navies compared to Rome 2 is that they will be able to move a very long way, being able to move from one end of the map to the other in a few turns. This will make fleets a great way to project your power to distant places quickly. Like in Rome 2, your armies will be able to act like a navy by sending them through your ports. The only difference will be that doing this will cost you money and take a turn to represent the time gathering, building or buying the ships and supplies needed to set an army to sea. Transport ships will be quite weak in combat, easy to sink and hard to turn. They will be okay at boarding actions or receiving boarders, however all land units in transports receive a stat penalty when fighting at sea like in Attila, although perhaps not so harsh. You will be able to move transport ships into navies for protection. Transport ships will slow the navy down a little, but will still move very far, so you will be able to move troops from, say, Italy to Spain in 2 turns, one turn preparing ships and another sailing. It might seem like a fast journey, but actually it's not much considering that 2 turns is 2 months, and it certainly doesn't take that long to sail that distance even in the ships of antiquity. I believe historical sources from the time described sailing to Greece from southern Italy as taking about 3 days, so in a month they could sail pretty much anywhere. So transporting your armies by sea will be a more viable option where the waters are safe and secure, since they can just zoom from your core to the edge of your empire very fast. This power will add an in-game significance to controlling the waters around your lands, as stopping enemy movements and conducting your own will be really important. Navies will be able to create blockades of regions just like in Rome 2. It won't be so much a case of blockading a single port, more of the region's coastline in general, since there may be several small ports in the region's private building slots as well. So all get blockaded at once just for convenience, stopping trade, blocking any suppliers going through the ports, and removing any food the ports generated from fishing. All these effects will make naval blockades much more useful in the game, able to strangle factions that depend on the sea as a reward for winning sea control from them. Another naval feature, making a return from Empire Total War actually, will be independently controlled pirate factions. There will probably be a few different pirate factions with different areas, with different kinds of ships in use, that will be hostile to each other but generally operate in their own little spheres so they won't often interact. Pirates will operate mostly from small islands and small coastal regions that will have basically no buildings or infrastructure, just docks and a basic food supply. The pirates make money to get more ships by raiding, and then once they have lots of ships, they might attack a faction and make demands for money or food through the diplomacy screen. If never accounted for, pirate fleets will make trading really hard, so their existence will add some more incentives for the player to commit to controlling water regions. Pirate regions can be captured, with the pirate faction associated being destroyed if you get all their bases. They don't make good regions really, but they are handy naval bases since they'll already be set up to facilitate shipbuilding and be in strategic locations near trade routes. A pirate faction can re-emerge when a coastal region rebels. A pirate fleet will appear in the water beside the region, representing the people who are joining the rebellion in a more personally advantageous way, taking a chance to break off from their faction for a life of crime. The fleet will try to capture a region with naval facilities to use as a new base, probably able to reach one of the old pirate bases in the turn after it spawns, so you need to act right away if you want to intercept them. They will be large enough that they will generally win port assaults on small regions. Once they successfully take a base, they will return to acting as the pirate faction, getting money through raiding, attacking other bases to expand, and terrorizing factions to extort them. As a last note about navies, they will share the trait with armies where their line of sight, by default, is pretty much just their zone of control, although your trade routes will always be visible with a zone of control sized visible area around the route, so navies can only really hide out in the sea when they aren't near anything, which might mean attrition if not prepared. Diplomacy. Now it's time for a nice big one, diplomacy. There are lots of parts to this, so this section will have lots of subsections. Everyone seems to have complaints of various kinds about diplomacy, so this is always a fun topic. In this section, I will be talking about what kinds of options you will have within the diplomacy system, but I'll save the discussion on what kinds of diplomacy the AI is going to conduct for a later discussion on campaign AI as a whole. As noted earlier, diplomacy will take place partially in the ruler's chamber. You will have a similar overlay to Rome 2 where you can look at a simplified version of the campaign map and pick which faction you want to talk to, either from a list or by clicking on one of their regions. You'll get information on their current relations, the causes of all the ups and downs, and what treaties you have already. When you pick a faction to talk to, the information on the relevant faction stays on the screen, but the view comes out of the campaign map to see a diplomat from that faction now standing before you. The same thing, of course, will happen if that faction is talking to you. Now, you might wonder why the diplomacy always happens in your ruler chamber, and the reason is probably performance. I want the transition from the campaign map to the chamber to be seamless, so if the game suddenly needs to load a new chamber when you try and talk to them, it might make it too janky. Or maybe not, in which case, when you are initiating diplomacy, you see the target's ruler's chamber, but from the opposite perspective, looking at the faction leader at his desk, with all the same little tweaks and decorations that adorn your chamber visible for theirs, like trophies from battle, public order indicators outside, and the chamber reflecting what sort of environment the leader is currently in. But all the aesthetics aside, let's talk about the options you'll have. Region trades and annexing. A big point to make off the bat is that region trading will be fully supported in Rome 3, both with enemies as part of deals and between allies who just want to make a fair trade for some strategic reason. Regions can be bought for audacious sums of money in some cases, particularly from your vassals or very close allies. The perceived value of the region trade will increase a lot if the region you are offering someone is part of their core. So for example, if you conquer into a faction's lands, then offer peace when you realise they are about to screw you over, you might be able to offer them one of their core provinces back, which they'd be a bunch more willing to think about than a border territory. Similar to region trading, and similar to the concept of confederation in Rome 2, you will have a new territory-based option called Annex. Annex simply adds an existing region into your faction, and will be possible when the holder of the region is very weak in comparison to you but also matches your culture. It's a peaceful way to expand into lands you have no quarrel with that won't be too opposed to the idea and would benefit from the protection of your faction. These regions might get a big public order hit when you annex them, but if you hold on to them, it's a free region. although perhaps you did have to grease the wheels of the deals with some money, if not some healthy threats. This annex feature will essentially be the functional replacement for Rome 2's confederation system, while that confederation system will evolve into something a little less cheesy. Confederations. Instead of just absorbing other factions wholesale, Confederation will temporarily make the faction involved your vassal and give you control of their existing military units. I think this will be a much better representation of how historical confederations of factions worked. You can't control the economics or buildings of these confederated vassals, but they will provide a stream of new units for the duration of the confederation, with markers on the unit cards to tell you which faction the unit originally belonged to, and probably info on how much longer you have it for in a tooltip. The confederation ends when the number of turns you have set it for passes, the leading faction is destroyed, or the leading faction negotiates peace with the primary enemy. The whole point is that a confederation is just like a really strong military alliance designed to deal with a huge mutual enemy, not be about submission to the lead faction forever like in Rome 2. In Rome 3, the focus on it being the military units you control, not the faction as a whole, should enable a more realistic feel. And perhaps you can try to annex confederated factions if you really are in a position to control them entirely, it just won't happen by default. So you get all these extra units, the upkeep of which you have to pay yourself, but of course that's mitigated by the fact the confederated factions are your vassals, so half their money is going to you. The confederation will initially be set for a specified number of turns, and you can use the diplomacy system to renew it at any time, assuming the conditions that allowed the confederation in the first place still exist, which is usually that your factions are the same culture and both at war with an enemy who is more powerful than you individually. You don't need to have good relations, and that is the key difference between a confederation and an alliance. Being in confederation will improve relations for all involved factions, so maybe teaming up to kill some Romans is the way to convince the other Gallic tribes that you really are a great faction and they should definitely let you annex them once this is all over. They will get annoyed if you lose lots of their units though, so don't think you can use confederation to force another faction to do all the dirty work, just some of the dirty work. Now, the confederated factions will be allowed to recruit new troops that won't automatically be under your control. It will be a little like the old Crusade system from Medieval 2, where the faction must choose to add these forces to the Confederation army. This will be important because sometimes the situation might require a confederated faction to deal with some personal business for which it still needs a military, so they will probably try to maintain some forces with what money they have left for this reason. On the flip side, you will be allowed to disband Confederation troops. So if you find your new partners had such large militaries that you can't afford to lead them all, you can downsize them on your partner's behalf. This opens up the possibility for a great betrayal strategy, where you confederate with someone, disband their forces and then just rush their settlements. You'll risk actually being attacked and defeated by the enemy you confederated against, but that's why it's a strategic choice. Oh, and your diplomatic reputation would be destroyed, of course, so you probably aren't going to win friends for a while if you do this. Maybe you don't care about that, so that's fine. In a similar vein, you will have some responsibility to the confederated factions. If you don't use the forces you've been gifted to actually keep the enemy out of their lands, that might cause some bad blood. So it's not totally just free troops to use, you need to actually achieve the goals of the Confederation factions, namely not being killed by the enemy and preferably killing said enemy. Now, since the Confederation system is changed to retain some independence for a faction, if you're feeling particularly passive and aren't very strong, you might accept an offer from another faction to join their Confederation, waving goodbye to your men and hoping they defeat whoever it was who was coming for you. This might be a legitimately good idea if you find yourself at war with a superior opponent and aren't strong enough to lead a confederation. Either you let them destroy you, or you pool your men with those from another faction to destroy them. Of course, you're putting your men in the hands of the AI, so I think this strategy would be a last resort move when you literally have 2 units against the enemy's 40 and you hope that joining the confederation will make an army come over to save you. Also remember that you will be able to build new units that won't be part of the Confederation unless you send them off to join it, so if they take your forces off to the other side of the world, you won't be left with nothing to do. You will also have the diplomatic option to leave the Confederation at any time, but likely the other factions will hate you for breaking the deal. A similar thing will happen if you negotiate a separate peace with the Confederation's enemy. In summary, the Confederation will be a quite serious strategy that only gets whipped out in the mid to late game where lots of small factions are threatened by a large one. But it won't be a total union of those factions, just a combined effort to match your army strength in an all-or-nothing military alliance. If they are lucky, when you see factions confederating against you, you'll just think, screw it, I'll leave them be and go find an easier target, just as they would have hoped. Alliances. Alliances will remain largely the same from Rome 2, with the three-tier system of the non-aggression pact, defensive pact, and full alliance returning as well. The differences will show up when actually operating alongside allies. The war target system from Rome 2, where you specify a settlement or army for your allies to help you with, will be expanded to allow a separate target given for every allied army. This of course will prove essential when you have 2 or more allies and want them to help you with different things. But unlike in Rome 2 where war targets were always agreed on, in Rome 3 the allied power has 2 key abilities, 1 to refuse a request and 2 to give you requests as well. This will hopefully lead to a more interactive relationship with your allies, a more two-way relationship that can be built up further by helping them out, or exploited by having them help you and then ignore them when they are in need. Plus, being able to make more army-specific requests should allow you to make better use of allied forces when you're fighting on a front together, less time just silently hoping your ally will do what you need. Reply attitudes. Now let's discuss a change to how you can react to another faction's proposition. You will be able to do the same thing that the AI does when it reacts, choosing to react with different styles based on how outraged or happy it is with the deal. So say the AI comes up and asks to trade with you. There are 4 possible responses, aside from making a counter-offer. You can make an outraged rejection, a solid rejection, a willing acceptance, and an ecstatic acceptance. So that's in order of least happy to most happy. Why do you need different styles? It's part of managing your relationship with that faction, and will work in conjunction with your balance of power compared to that faction. It has the potential to get complex, which is why we're limiting it to only 2 new responses. Basically, you can choose the extreme responses if there is a message you want to send to another faction. And what the message is will depend on how balanced the AI thinks the proposal is. Outrage rejections will generally cause a reduction in relations, while ecstatic acceptances will generally increase relations. But both of these effects are twisted around when your factions aren't balanced power-wise. Being really nice to a small faction will be seen as a sign that you really can't have them attack you right now, possibly tempting them to join your enemies. While being horrid to a faction larger than you could be considered a show of force that will dissuade attack. But the extreme options have more subtle long-term effects as well. When you violently reject a deal, you are sending a message to all factions that whatever was proposed was not acceptable. In this way, you are building your diplomatic reputation, a nice roleplay touch, and indeed a gameplay touch, as if you want to be a ruthless faction, maybe a few messenger beheadings will make the world learn that if they don't come to you with a pretty damn amazing deal, peace is not on the table. Similarly, being overly happy about a deal will signal what kinds of things you like, making it likely you'll get more similar deals, especially from the friends of the faction you dealt with. Overall, these extreme options will hopefully lead to diplomacy being a little more intelligent, as there will be fewer outrageous propositions or deals that don't interest you. You won't be finding yourself in a situation like in Empire Total War telling the Maratha Confederacy for the 12th time that you don't want to sell Jamaica to them. You put your foot down when silly offers are made and the AI learns that it is being silly, reducing silliness in the future. A feature that could make the campaign diplomacy much more satisfying. Food trading. A new option, aside from regular trade agreements, will be the import or export of food. Your faction's food surplus will be available to use as a kind of currency, selling it to other factions who are low or buying it from someone when you are low. This is a feature rooted in history, since one of the key reasons for having secure trade routes was that food supplies moved along them, especially for Rome, which was importing food en masse from Africa until it conquered it. Food imports will be a little unstable, vulnerable to blockades or piracy, but will offer the key advantage of having a larger population cap on your settlements without having to develop your own farming infrastructure, which of course will be important if it simply can't be developed further. The system would work on a very basic pricing system, with food having a global value based on the total surplus of all factions. It would be possible to add in a barter system where you could haggle the price up, especially when you know the faction asking can't get food from other places. If it doesn't make the deals end up being too complicated or a chore to arrange, that will be there too. A practical point which may arise from testing this feature is the need to actively decide how much of your food surplus you want to put on the market. What we want to avoid is a case where you have a food surplus of 1, and every turn half the factions come to you asking to buy it and you have to turn them all down. It very much depends on how the AI uses this system, but there may in principle be a little slider somewhere in the faction management screen to put food on the market, and once the exports have been agreed that you will be left alone even if you do have more in surplus. Peace treaties. Peace treaties in Rome 3 will generally be easier to come by, with more options on how to satisfy both parties. The region and food trading features provide extra currencies aside from money to help balance the bargains. You would have the ability to demand food for free in exchange for peace, meaning that, although you might not have finished your enemy, the fact they're now sending you 30 food a turn will both stifle their abilities to attack you anymore and boost your growth for free. Part of peace being easier comes down to the AI. As mentioned earlier, we are going to discuss this in detail later, but in summary the AI will be sensible. It will be attempting to survive and will attempt to negotiate peace the moment you gain an advantage in a war, possibly offering up a region they think you would have conquered anyway. This will allow moves like those in the Paradox strategy games, where you can weaken a faction by defeating their armies and then forcing them to surrender territory in exchange, while leaving them with something at the end of the day. Since we have the supply system in place, attacking will be a little harder, so pressing for region trades like this will be a more appealing way of doing the work than actually taking it. That is, unless you plan on destroying the faction entirely, in which case you send the peace envoy's head back in a box and they will not ask again unless they can make a much juicier offer. Another peace treaty related option you'll have is asking for peace between other factions. You can get a faction to agree to seek peace with a faction it is at war with. Do this to both sides in the war and peace will be pretty much guaranteed. In this way, you can do a little social engineering, making sure the factions you want to be in your sphere of influence are all friends, giving you a nice unified bloc. It's especially important when you want your vassals to stop fighting each other so they can focus on your own enemies. You might also bribe a rival to stop a war that it's winning, as you really don't want them to take whatever lands they might have got if the war continued. Post-battle options. The options for what you can do after a battle are going to be similar, but I want to note a few details that will make things play slightly differently. First, I'll cover something which is a pre-battle option as well, retreating. You can decide to retreat from a battle before it begins, or are forced to retreat when you lose, just like in Rome 2. The only difference is that you can pick where your army will retreat to. This, for me, is a critical omission from the previous Total War games. Your generals will lead your armies into ridiculous places just to avoid battles, dooming themselves to die. Really, we need to be able to give them a target place to retreat to. It will have limitations though. Firstly, you are forced to retreat away from the thing that is threatening you, giving you a limited arc of directions for the retreat. If you are retreating because you lost a battle, you will have to retreat by a minimum distance, while if retreating to avoid battle, you can move as little or as far as you wish and your movement points will allow. The key purpose will be to retreat to a strong point like a fort or river crossing, settlement or hidden position like a forest, basically anything that protects your army. Or maybe you only challenged the enemy to battle to see the balance bar, and now you want to retreat and just go back to where you were standing before. What I want to avoid is cases like in Empire, where you move up to battle, click to retreat rather than fight, and you just totally lose control of your army. It suddenly uses up all of its movement points, spiraling all over the place, when really I just wanted them to step back into their fort. So let's suppose you've won a battle. You will get, like in Rome 2, the option to release your captives, enslave them, or kill them. But also like in Attila, I want to make use of the ability to use captives to replace your own losses. Only not in the liberal way that Attila did it. I found that crazy. You would end up with your entire army composing of enemy captives very rapidly with no penalty. In Rome 3, taking on warriors will only be possible when fighting an army of the same culture as yours, and will only restore troops of the units that aren't recruited from the global unit pool, your lesser units that aren't as tied to your faction's identity or require special equipment to field. It will come with an immediate drop in the army's integrity, and a negative baseline integrity effect to keep it lower in the long term. This effect wears off over time though. It is meant to represent the distrust of captives in your ranks and eventual acceptance, a touch I think is essential to make the concept of take-on warriors make sense. The other options will work as in Rome 2, with releasing captives, providing an improved relationship with the enemy and their friends, enslaving them, adding them to your slave population across your faction, and executing them, denying the enemy some of their military population but making them and their friends dislike you. The effect of release and execute will be greater than in Rome 2, with more major changes in relationship arising, as right now in Rome 2 I feel the extra point or two doesn't make a difference when you can easily have -300 relationship while at war with someone. Since you're deciding the fates of actual people, the choice will hopefully feel a little deeper. Releasing captives gives the enemy more of a chance against you, but also means if you get a settlement of theirs to surrender later, it will be more productive for you. On the flip side, killing them reduces the productivity of their faction's lands, making them less valuable for you as a possible prize in the war. Now after sieges, you will have similar options to Rome 2 as well. Occupy, loot and occupy, sack, liberate and subjugate. Those last two are situational, while the other three will always be available. Sack will not involve occupying the settlement, but will destroy most of the population and buildings, leaving the settlement useless for a very long time, and prompting a likely irreversible drop in your relationship with the faction owning it. It also gives you a nice bunch of slaves, and restores your army's food supplies as an added incentive. Liberate will be used when the region you have taken used to be a core region of another faction. But different to Rome 2, it won't matter whether that faction is still in existence. If the faction was destroyed, it is created anew as your ally. If it still exists, they get the region back, and you get a massive boost with your relationship with them. It provides a key new option for supporting allies in war, or can just be used as a way to prove you mean business when trying to win a new ally. Subjugate is the equivalent of creating a vassal faction in Shogun 2, usable on a faction's capital region. You can subjugate a faction that was previously occupied by another faction. So you attack the lands of faction B, who control the capital of dead faction C. Subjugation restores faction C as your vassal. The other use is to go straight for the capital of faction B and subjugate them. The interesting thing here is that if you do this, their remaining regions will switch to being a new faction, the faction B loyalists, who don't accept that their leadership has bent the knee to the invaders. This doesn't really change anything, you still have to fight them, but maybe you'll have a little vassal to help out. Mainly it's just an immersion touch. Character skill trees and retainers. Just like in Rome 2, the characters in your political circle will gain experience for taking part in the campaign, and will gain levels, increasing their stats and providing points to spend on specialist skills. The skills themselves will have a different focus though, more about unlocking particular abilities or political opportunities as opposed to giving incremental boosts to the army they lead or the settlement they govern. The skill tree will be two trees, a military-focused one and a civil-focused one. Attila almost did this, but the two were still somewhat intertwined since the stat boosts you needed to succeed as a governor sometimes required you to advance a certain distance down the military trees. In Rome 3 it will be more clear-cut, so you can make simple choices about whether the character will be more useful for combat, for politics, or be mixed. You'll get 2 points to spend with each level. The levels themselves provide inherent bonuses, with generals getting a morale buff to troops, and politicians increasing the rate at which they gain gravitas, the political currency they'll need to get better state positions. The sorts of abilities you unlock will be more situational than in Rome 2, rather than passive buffs. Shogun 2 had a touch of this, where level-up abilities could unlock night battles, and the special ability Stand and Fight to use in battle. Rome 3 will include these abilities in the military chain, along with some others that will unlock special unit abilities for their armies, which we'll discuss in the section about battles. There would still be the odd passive buff, with things like faster movement, better retention of integrity, and reduced supply usage, but it will steer clear of small-scale buffs to the army's combat stats. On the civil side, you will have abilities that allow you to apply to higher offices without age or level requirements being met, to enact special edicts in governed provinces like rationing, things that generally require skilled management basically, or perhaps to be able to control construction of some of the private building slots. These abilities will be things you can play fine without, but will help once unlocked. Passive buffs might include faster gravitas gain, improved public order for governed settlements, and faster construction times. Now, as well as their level ups, the characters will have traits affecting their stats and possibly their abilities. Like in Rome 1 and 2, the generals will have positive or negative traits that will make them more or less suited to certain things. Rome 3's system will be most modelled after Rome 1's system, where traits are gained based on what the character does, e.g. being a governor for a long time gives them traits that primarily affect their ability to govern. And unlike Rome 2, the traits you gain will often be positive ones that improve the character, making them better at the thing they keep doing. You will also have retainers to characters, with the system again being more akin to Rome 1's than Rome 2's, in that it will be possible to gain a large number of retainers at once. But the system will also borrow something from Attila in that you will be able to assign someone from your political circle to be a retainer to a character. What effects that has will depend on the retainee's stats and traits. It will cause them to gain some experience whenever the master character does, and be much more likely to develop similar traits to the master character, especially if the retainer character is young. Making someone a retainer to someone who is a lower level than them will cause them to become disloyal, so it won't be universally useful. But for new characters and inexperienced characters, it gives them a running start to their role in the campaign. You won't have a retainer pool like in Rome 2, as I never thought that made any sense. The retainers are people with a personal relationship to the character and aren't interchangeable. The retainer system is almost like a random bonus system, where you can't be sure what kinds of retainers your characters will gather, but most of them will be useful for something, so it will be a pleasant surprise most of the time. And like traits, the retainers gained will be somewhat determined by what the character does. So for example, campaigning generals fighting battles are more likely to get military retainers like veterans or sword bearers. Buildings and their functions. Buildings in Rome 3 will usually have a very specific purpose, and will be less about increasing the value of the province, since that will primarily be done through the private building slots. You will have the ability to put farms and industry in your state slots if you have nothing better to do, but generally you'll use the slots to expand the mechanisms of the government. As has been mentioned previously, buildings will not usually have an arbitrary penalty linked to them as part of the Food, Public Order, Tax Income Balancing Act. All three of those things will be balanced independently. Buildings just do whatever it is they do, and only reduce the food supply or upset the population if that is an unavoidable side effect of what it does. The balance on what buildings you make and how far you upgrade them will simply be money and technology. So for example, if you build a training area in your Celtic village, it just unlocks recruitment slots, maybe low-tier units. You might later research the ability to have professional units, allowing you to upgrade the training area into a barracks, unlocking new units but otherwise not doing anything. A simple to follow arrangement basically. Let's run through a few possible examples of what kinds of things you'll use buildings for. We've already discussed the use of military training buildings for recruitment, a basic market and industry or agriculture buildings for getting money and food supplies up. There will be a spy office that makes it hard for enemy spies to remain in the settlement and gives the region extra line of sight across borders, as well as giving better spy recruitment. There will be engineers' workshops providing a research slot and the ability to field basic siege weapons in armies if you have the technology for it. There will be a supply centre that increases the reserve in the settlement and allows recruitment of baggage train units to accompany armies. There will be entertainment buildings like theatres, inns and arenas that will improve baseline public order, possibly with a running financial cost. There will be a variety of defensive upgrades like walls, towers of assorted levels and internal strongpoints that will give a slight public order boost, but mainly be for improving your performance in siege battles fought at the settlement. There will be religious buildings, helping to spread culture and improve public order if your culture is dominant already. There will be academic buildings like libraries, academies and gymnasia that will provide research, improve order and wealth, and like in Rome 1, improve the abilities of your characters while in the settlement. There will be buildings dedicated to the recruitment of superior troops like master blacksmiths, training camps and military headquarters, providing increased stats to units from the settlement. There will be an embassy, which improves relations with other factions and spreads your culture a little into regions beyond your borders. There will be public health buildings that improve public order and population growth. All these examples aren't definitive, just thoughts on the kind of buildings that will suit the overall design of the game. And I list them just to give an idea of the types of things you'll be thinking about when planning build orders in Rome 3. Units. We've talked about buildings, now let's broadly talk about the military units in the game. As you may have gathered, units are roughly divided into two types, militia or levy style units and trained or professional style units, with all factions having different focuses across the two types. Professional units are capped by the unit pool for the faction and cost more to recruit and upkeep, but are in general better and provide better return on the investment of supplies to keep them marching. Militia units are easy to recruit en masse and easy to replenish, but are simply less powerful and disciplined, so require more skill to use effectively. For many factions, certain units will only be able to be recruited from regions that have been made into corps. An easy example is the Roman legionary, simulating how they were recruited from Roman citizens, and citizens were those people in what Rome was prepared to call its core regions. All regions will have mercenary units available, mainly from the militia pool but with the odd professional unit for hire. The units will be based on the region's cultural mix, so in a region that is half Latin, half Celtic, you might see a few officially disbanded Hastati maniples for hire alongside some disenfranchised Celtic warbands. There will be technologies that allow the recruitment of foreign auxiliaries as professional soldiers, allowing you to recruit units of other cultures in regions where that culture is dominant. This is of course most relevant to Rome, but in Rome 3 it will be possible for your random Irish tribe to have researched this military doctrine as well, and be recruiting Greek hoplites into their armies as auxiliaries from conquered Massalia. Just like in all Total War games, the units available will be inspired by historical information on the faction. The actual region you are recruiting in will be important too, with the culture determining what units are trainable and the availability of mounts determining the availability of cav, elephant riders and camel riders. For performance reasons, the size of the units will be scalable, with a target normal size of about 100 men for infantry, 25 men for cav, giving you something like 375 for people who just turn up the scale right away. The balance of cav unit sizes against infantry is more in favour of infantry than in Rome 2, reflecting the rareness and high status of cavalry units in the ancient world. For factions that specialise in cav, like the steppe peoples, the cav units will be larger, perhaps 50 men per unit, although with double the upkeep, so the balance is still the same on a whole army scale. Units will be broadly classified as light, medium and heavy variants of their types, the types being things like swords, spears, bows, etc. These classifications will be ways to estimate the strength of units you aren't familiar with and make quick strategies based on the knowledge that heavy cav beats light cav, that sort of thing. That said, not all units will fit a clear classification. Some units will be mixed type, with their classification having two markers. For example, there might be a unit that is a Celtic warband, mainly a melee unit, but they have some of their soldiers equipped with bows, so that while stationary they subject the enemy to a small amount of arrow fire. This might be called a medium melee/light bow infantry unit. And units like the Greek pelters might be called a heavy skirmish/medium melee infantry. Some barbarian factions will have the interesting medium slinger, medium spear combination, the enemy of cavalry raids. On the topic, one feature that would be nice would be units of mixed specialities, so your warband units of 100 men are 25 spearmen, 25 axemen, 10 swordsmen, 20 archers, 20 skirmishers. This would be the ideal way to portray units, and the most historical, since really apart from the Roman army, most ancient armies had no unit system to speak of, and were just groups of men with all kinds of weapons following their local chiefs or warlords, possibly alongside other groups following their own chiefs as part of an army where all the chiefs were following a king. Rarely did they deploy a regiment of archers. There would just be some people with bows scattered randomly throughout the groups or across the battlefield supporting melee troops from their village. In fact, the mixed formation is extremely common throughout all of history, so would be great to implement in Total War. But the clear reason not to is one of performance and ease of understanding. A mixed unit means you have to use different sets of stats to determine that unit's combat outcome, the stats used changing man to man. That adds a processor overhead which is alleviated by having the whole unit use a single set of numbers in all circumstances. I think the performance boost from this is so large that it's basically a requirement. So Rome 3 will continue to make the sacrifice of dividing armies up into specialist units. It also helps make the game easy to understand, and really cements the tactics element since everything has its strengths and weaknesses due to not mixing their composition to balance their combat abilities out. Vassal battles. Now here's something totally new for Total War, the ability to take control of battles that take place outside of your faction. When you have a faction as a vassal, you will be given the option to manually fight the battles they encounter, giving your vassals a better chance than the auto-resolve. This will make having a vassal a bit more meaningful, as you really can commit to keeping them alive in this way. It also helps reflect the control of the faction you are meant to have as part of the vassal and master relationship. When you win a battle with a vassal army, they will be grateful and your relationship will improve, especially in battles where the enemy had the advantage. You will be asked to pick a general from your army to represent you in this intervention, and that general will gain experience from the encounter. It won't be hugely realistic in that it will just let you pick any of your characters no matter where they are, just to keep it as easy to manage as possible and make sure you don't really have to think much about this feature. It will be completely ignorable, of course, if you don't care so much about the fates of the vassal in question.